In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories.
Your Honor, I've got a language arts emergency here. I need to get a search warrant ASAP. No, I am not going to say ASAP. That's an initialism. ASAP is an acronym, and you know how much I love acronyms. Search warrant. Yes, I know what warrant means. I know that warrant means the probable connection between my theory, my claim about this crime, and the evidence that I think is in this guy's house. I'm right here. No, I can't wait 2 hours. I can only wait 8 seconds. Why? Because 8 seconds is the length of the theme song. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of our series on argument. You need a warrant. And no, I'm not actually talking about like a search warrant or an arrest warrant, but when we use the word warrant talking about arguments, we're using it in a pretty similar way to the way warrants get used in the criminal justice system. That's why, you know, the Law and Order ripoff and our detective friend in the opening spot there. And to keep that criminal justice theme going, I want to give an example that I think might explain or at least illustrate why warrants are important in an argument. And it's this. Let's say one day I finally snap and I bludgeon a student to death for not putting away their cell phone. Look, I would never actually do that. I'm really quite a softie. Death is kind of icky, and bludgeoning, there's brain matter, and I don't want to have to clean it up. I wouldn't actually do it. But let's pretend, right? And in fact, I was going to bring a hammer with me out here to the park to film this episode, but I forgot. So I used my sunglasses case to bludgeon a student to death in this hypothetical example. They arrest me. They put me on trial. The prosecutor stands up at the beginning of the trial and says, Bullock bludgeoned a student to death because they wouldn't put away their cell phone. Now, if she sits down there and says, I rest my case, what's going to happen? That's right. I'm going to walk free. I will be free to roam and freely bludgeon students as much as necessary. I'm really talking about this too much. I should probably call my therapist. Anyway, no, she's going to bring some evidence to the party. She's going to say, Bullock bludgeoned a student to death with his sunglasses case. This sunglasses case right here. She's going to put that down on the table. And then what would happen if she sat down and said, I rest my case? That's right. I would still go free. She has brought the evidence, but she hasn't explained how that evidence actually connects to the claim that I bludgeoned a student to death. So here's what she's going to say for real. Bullock bludgeoned a student to death with his sunglasses case. This sunglasses case that we found at the crime scene that has the victim's blood on it, and it has fingerprints on it, and those fingerprints only belong to Bullock. Then she's going to rest her case, and I'm, what's the word for it? Screwed. That's why the warrant is important. In an argument, it provides the link between the claim that you're trying to demonstrate as being valid and true and the evidence that you've used to support that claim. Let me put up a bigger definition of it, right? So your warrant connects the claim to the evidence, and it could be phrased something like, this evidence supports my claim because, okay? You don't have to use that phrasing in your arguments. In fact, that phrasing is a little bit weird. But warrants are critical for making any argument work. Now, here's what's kind of, on the one hand, cool about a warrant, but also frustrating about a warrant in an argument, is that a warrant can sometimes be an unspoken thing or an unwritten thing. Because if you're talking about the rules or the principles or the concepts or the links or the ideas that connect a piece of evidence to your claim, those might not always be things that you can or that you need to say out loud or write down on paper. And I'll talk about our example text. If this is the first video in the series that you're watching, I encourage you, you're going to go down to the first link in the description, and it's going to take you to a text called A Presumption of Guilt by Bryan Stevenson. And that's the one that we've been using as our mentor text for this series on argument. Bryan Stevenson is trying to suggest that America's long history of lynchings and violence against African Americans still resonates today in the second half of the second decade of the 21st century. And he doesn't ever say a sentence like, lynching is bad. And there's a good reason for that. Who is going to disagree with him? You put a microphone in front of anybody's face with a camera and you say, the historical practice of lynching, yay or nay, they're going to say nay. But that doesn't mean Stevenson needs no warrants at all. In fact, he's got warrants throughout his text, and I want to talk about a couple of them in particular. Let's look at this first one. In this paragraph, Stevenson talks about the quote, legal lynching of the, quote, Scottsboro boys, 9 African-American kids. And again, I encourage you to read this entire text. It is good. It is a fantastic model. And it's about a topic that I think doesn't get enough attention. He says that the Scottsboro boys were arrested and tried in what was essentially a sham trial, and they were convicted. And then when people complained, the system was like, what? We tried them. We gave them a hearing in court. So here's Stevenson's last sentence. I'm going to put it up big again. In reality, many defendants of the era learned that the prospect of being executed rather than lynched did little to introduce fairness into the outcome. Remember, his claim is that the period of lynchings from after the end of the Civil War until 1950, I mean, well into the 20th century, he says that those lynchings still resonate today. They still affect our legal system. So he's using this case where there was a trial and using this link, this warrant, to connect it back to his claim that when African Americans were put on trial instead of lynched, the outcome was no different. They are found guilty and executed regardless. Now I want to go to a second example from Stevenson's text, and this time he kind of outsources the warrant to one of his sources, one of the people that he's been relying on to provide evidence in this text. So let's take a look at this paragraph. And it starts with one of the best words in the English language. Here we go. In the face of this national ignominy, there is still an astonishing failure to acknowledge, discuss, or address the history of lynching. Right? Ignominy there means shame. The history of what we as Americans collectively and individually did to African Americans after the Civil War and well into the 20th century is shameful, he says. And I'm not going to provide any argument against that. And he goes into some more detail. Let's go back to the paragraph. He says, many of the communities where lynchings took place have gone to great lengths to erect markers and memorials to the Civil War, to the Confederacy, to the events and incidents in which local power was violently reclaimed by white people. And it's true, if you're in the southern United States right now and you're watching this, you can probably think of, dozen places within 50 or 100 miles of you that commemorate things from the Civil War or from the antebellum, another big word, it means literally before the war, the antebellum period when slavery was the thing. Here in the North, we don't have that so much. But what Stevenson is arguing is that as many of those memorials as exist to the Civil War and to slavery and to the heroes of the Confederacy, there really aren't any about lynchings. There really aren't any about what happened in those same places to African Americans after the war. And take a look at the last sentence. At the last sentence, he's going to paraphrase. You might remember from the last episode, quote, paraphrase, summarize. Here, he's going to paraphrase one of his sources, Sherrilyn Ifill's book, On the Courthouse Lawn. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Here's the last sentence in that paragraph. As Ifill has argued, the absence of memorials to lynching has deepened the injury to African Americans and left the rest of the nation ignorant of this central part of our history. Now, when he says our in that sentence, I don't know if he's talking about our as African Americans, because both Sherrilyn Ifill and Bryan Stevenson are African Americans, or if he means our as in Americas in general. I think both of those things are probably true. Americans don't have as much knowledge and awareness and just general aptitude about what happened to African Americans after the Civil War, because that part of our history doesn't get taught. And it's because we don't know this that those events, that shame, still resonates today, 150 years after the war ended. And look, it's no coincidence that the warrants I pulled out of Stevenson's text to talk about came from the ends of their respective paragraphs. It's really, really hard to show the connection between a claim you haven't stated yet and evidence you haven't shown yet. You have to wait until after both of those are clearly established to put in your warrant. If you flash back to the previous series on paragraphs, you might remember that in the body paragraphs episode, I provided a couple of templates for writing body paragraphs. There was the MELCON and the CEL. There's an L in both of those acronyms, and that L stands for link. In each of those cases, we have your main idea, your evidence, your link, or your claim, your evidence, your link. The link part comes at or near the end of the paragraph. And Stevenson sticks to that with his evidence, as long as he is actually using a warrant. Because, as I said previously, Stevenson doesn't have to provide a warrant for some of what he says. He doesn't need to say lynching was bad, slavery was bad, the South winning the Civil War would have been terrible. He doesn't need to say those things. Those are things that are common knowledge, or that his audience at least is going to agree with him on. And that brings me to my final point before I let you go, which is that when you write your warrant, when you write your body paragraph that has a warrant in it, you have to remember to keep everything apt. Okay, that's what I talked about in the previous series on paragraphs. Your paragraphs have to be mindful of who your audience is and what your purpose is, and they have to maintain a tone. And in particular, your body paragraphs, when you're thinking about the warrant, you do have to think about who your audience is. Now, I started way back in episode 1 of this series by saying that, look, your audience probably knows less than you think it does. And so it is better to over-explain than to take your audience's knowledge for granted and end up writing a poor argument. Stevenson knows that his audience in the New York Review of Books is going to be a fairly educated audience and is going to generally agree with them about the terrible history of lynching and racism in this country. But that doesn't mean he makes no warrants. Quite the opposite. It means that he has to be careful in selecting the warrants he does and putting in writing or saying out loud some of the assumptions that parts of his audience may not be able to hear or think of on their own. Particularly if it's an audience like me. I'm from the North. I am not thinking about the Civil War all the time. I'm not African American. I'm not thinking about racism all the time, although, you know, given current events, I probably should be. He knows that he's still going to have to spell some things out, that there are no memorials to lynching, and that's part of why Americans don't know that history. That even when African Americans were put on trial, those trials were nothing better than just a lynching dressed up in trial clothing. So that's warrants. It's really difficult for me to say this is the way you write a warrant. It's really, really easy, because in fact, it isn't. If I want you to take one thing away from this episode, it's that thinking about the assumptions behind how your evidence connects to the claim and thinking about the principles that you hold that made you select that evidence in the first place is really an important part of writing your argument. You have to be able to work through these things in your head, and you have to understand why the evidence you've selected is good before you write. And even if you decide that you don't have to put down that lynching was bad, because who's going to disagree with you on that, you need to at least have in your head, oh, I'm going to use this evidence about lynching because, you know, lynching was bad. So that's the best I can do. Again, if you go to They Say, I Say, there are some pretty good templates for supporting what you are trying to say and making those connections. I can put a link down there. I encourage you to check that out. And I also encourage you to stay tuned for the next episode, because not only am I going to actually commit murder again and try to kill the 5-paragraph essay, I'm going to talk about a way of writing your argument where your warrant doesn't come at the end of every paragraph, but rather your warrant comes at the end of your essay. So I'll see you for the next one. It's a problem with being in the park. There are loud vehicles that go by. At least I'm not that guy going into the porta potty over there.